Hi everyone. Like as I already said, it's really cool to have the opportunity to present my first chapter to you guys, because in a way, like UQ is a special place for me, because this is where sort of my love for decision science and conservation planning actually started. And so when I left UQ in 2016 and came down to Melbourne, I first worked for another year or so. And then I finally decided I should also do my PhD. And here I go now. So 2018 I started, and 2.5 years later I can actually show you some results. And I'm part of two labs down here. One is COACO, the Quantitative and Applied Ecology Group. And the other one is the Marine Spatial Ecology and Conservation Lab. And so I straddle between these two labs, and my first chapter is a quantitative literature review on the use of decision scientific criteria in conservation planning. So, and as you can see, maybe, I don't know if you can see the title, it's 10 years of decision making for biodiversity conservation actions. So. And yeah, before I start, I wanted to do acknowledgement of country, and yeah, let's pause to reflect on the fact that we are meeting on stolen land of the oldest living civilization in the world. And I want to pay my respects to both the Jagera people and the Turrbal people in Brisbane, and the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, and their elders past, present, and emerging. And of course, I also respect all these other peoples, but they're just quite too many to name them all. So I just picked the ones where most of us are at the moment. Cool. So I'm quite passionate about strategic decision making and conservation in particular. And I also believe that there is an important and urgent need for strategic decision making and good decision making. So you're probably all aware of these large reviews and reports, like the Global Biodiversity Outlook. This one is the last one, and I think the next 10-year report is I think it gets released next week. But the last one stated that pressures on biodiversity will continue to increase at least until 2020, which is now and which has happened. And the status of biodiversity will continue to decline, which is quite obvious as well happening. And this is despite the fact that society's responses to the loss of biodiversity are increasing dramatically. So that means we're actually doing more, investing more time and more money, and putting more effort in place, and we're losing still more species and ecosystems than ever before. So that leads to the question if we are actually producing good management plans, and we just need to speed up and scale up and get things done on a larger scale, and or if we maybe need to improve our planning process, or maybe is this maybe a mix of the two. So to be able to assess that at all, it's important to have an idea what a good decision actually is. So what's the definition of a good decision? And fortunately, there's a lot of insight from the field of decision science. It's a whole field that just deals with decisions and how to make good decisions in complex situations. And some insights from there are some important criteria that are really helpful and important when you are in dealing with a complex problem. And one of this is that it's always good if you know what you actually want. So in a conservation context, that is usually having a clear objective, and preferably something that is quantifiable. Then it's also good to know how to actually get it. So in a conservation context, again, this is usually that you have a conceptual idea of how your actions link to the threat that you want to mitigate. Then it's also usually quite important to think about the real world. You're not acting in a vacuum. And in a conservation planning context, this usually comes in as any type of socioeconomic constraints. So are there any people that get maybe impacted by your conservation action? Are there industries that have maybe other plans in the area? Do you have an own limit with budget and time when you want to work on something? Then it's also usually beneficial to think about uncertainty and try to address it. And this can be usually done with a sensitivity analysis or some scenario planning. And hopefully you have already heard about these options in science. And then lastly, it's usually a very good idea to compare your different options and think deliberately about like any trade-offs that that might be. So usually, especially when you care about like multiple things, you it's very rarely the case that you can just have them all at, like at the same level. And so you have to think about the pros and cons of each options, because in one option you might get a little bit more of the one and therefore a little bit less of the other. And to make a rational effort to think through that is quite important before making the choice. So these points and criteria, they seem like common sense, but the big question is it really that common? And in conservation, usually when people are in such complex problems, like they try to seek help by the use of like some decision aiding frameworks, and probably you have heard at least some of them: adaptive management, systematic conservation planning, structured decision making, cost effectiveness analysis, and multi-criteria decision analyses. And these are frameworks that get frequently employed from conservation scientists that want to produce like some plan for conservation action. And these frameworks all share that they try to assist decision makers by employing a stepwise approach to a problem. So they all have quite broad instructions that you should do step by step certain things, and that aims at sort of not forgetting something important. And they all sort of suggest that you should always start by clarifying your decision context. You should then define objectives and evaluation criteria. As the next step, you then develop your alternatives. Then you estimate your consequence for all these alternatives. Then you think about trade-offs and make your selection. And then you implement your action. And in the best case, you actually monitor and see if the things that you expected to happen really happen. And sometimes you start like your decision process again. And although like all these frameworks have like these broad instructions, they also have a fair bit of vagueness and ambiguity like in these instructions. So like the detail and the actual things that are done within these steps are to a large extent up to the decision maker. And so the question is like how much decision science and how much of these criteria that I mentioned before are actually used within these steps when people make decisions for conservation planning. So I went out on a mission to find descriptions of planning processes for conservation actions from the literature. So I went to the Web of Science and I tried to find like any publication that mentioned decision making and the use of one of these frameworks that I just told you about. And I looked at 10 years from 2009 to 2018. So I found a lot of papers, and then I started to classifying them, and I wanted to keep track of the presence of these 5 decision-making criteria. So how many do actually include like a quantitative objective, a clear link between threat and action, thinking about socioeconomic constraints, doing some type of sensitivity or scenario analysis, and attempting to do a deliberation on trade-offs. Then I also kept track of these 5 different frameworks. So what type of framework do people use in this decision process? And I also kept track of 4 different types of managements that are usually quite frequently like the broad concepts in conservation, which are spatial prioritization, population management, threat abatement, and restoration. And then I also teased apart if these plans or description of planning processes were actually in an academic context or if they were applied. And what I mean by that is when they were in collaboration or they described they were done as a collaboration with management authorities, or they actually stated that what they planned for has been already applied in the implemented in the real world, then I would categorize it as a real world example. And when it was not clear in the paper by whom or how like this plan would ever be realized, then I would classify it as an academic paper. And as I said, like there was a lot of literature. I found like over 7,000 results, and I had then to troll through the titles and abstracts and could narrow it down to 1,200 papers, but I had to read these in more detail. And 466 examples actually then described like the decision process in enough detail that I could use them in my analysis. So that was my last 1.5 years. I spent mainly just staring at the screen and reading papers and classifying them. So a big question now, what did I find? So I'm trying to keep track of like how many of these criteria are actually used in the decision planning literature. When you just plot them sort of on the y-axis, you see the number of examples, and the bars are the different criteria. It doesn't look too bad, like as you remember, 466 examples in total, and most of these criteria, they appear in most of the examples. So between like, sort of like around like 80%, except for trade-offs that are apparently not very popular. So only about like 30% use them. But it's not so much interesting of like how often individual criteria appear, but important is more like how often are they actually used in combination. And this gives quite the different picture. So from these 466 examples that I found, 338 were in an academic context, and 128 were real-world examples, which were like either in a collaboration with management authorities or reportedly already implemented. And these like horizontal bar graphs just show you how much criteria are used in combination. So on the top is sort of like only one criteria of these 5 is used. Unfortunately, that not many planning processes do that. But there is about almost, sort of like 20% in academic and in real-world examples that only use 2 of them. And that sort of like translates to about a quarter of all planning processes that are described in the peer-reviewed literature use only 1 or 2 of these important criteria, which I think is yes, interesting. And I'm not sure if anyone can convince me that this is not a bit varying. Then a lot use like 3 criteria, and 4 is also quite common, and 5 is sort of best practice, but obviously also not the standard. And I mean, depends like if you are optimist or pessimist, you can either say, oh, it's great, like 50% of the described examples use 4 or 5 criteria, or you could say, oh, 50% of all described planning processes in the literature use less than 4 criteria, and they just neglect, you know, at least 2 of them. So, but of course, to be able to understand like what might be implications and where could you maybe improve things that we do, it's good to have a closer look. So there are a couple of things that I found out, and the first is that all frameworks are equal, but some are more equal than others. And what I mean by that is that I tried to find out like how often different frameworks are used in different contexts, and how well they're doing with including the different criteria. And maybe I can walk you through that. So because it's like a lot of information in here. So I split up like all the examples into a stack of real-world examples, like in the upper half of this, and into the academic stack in the lower part of this. And here on the x-axis, you see the percent of frameworks across all examples. So like from 100% academic examples, sort of about 50% use systematic conservation planning. And these little labels show you the actual count of examples. So you see the absolute majority in the academic planning literature that describe decision processes use systematic conservation planning. And the second most used framework is adaptive management. Here it's like 70 examples, about a quarter use that. And the other frameworks are a little bit like less used, and structured decision making here is almost never used. And in the real world, you see a slightly different picture. So you see that the use of these different frameworks is much more balanced out. So people use like all sorts of frameworks apparently. Just like these 2, the cost effectiveness and multi-criteria decision analysis are slightly less often used. And now I wanted to know how does this change if I look at just the stack of best practice examples, like the ones that use actually all 5 criteria. that use like a quantitative objective, a clear link between threat and action, think about socioeconomic constraints, do a sensitivity analysis, and think about trade-offs. And what you can see here is that it changes quite a bit. So in academia, you still have the dominance of systematic conservation planning, still around 50%, but the adaptive management is much less important. And it gets like used, or it has like as many examples as like the most other frameworks. And in the real world, you see that like structured decision-making is almost like half of the examples in the best practice stack use this framework. And again, like adaptive management is all of a sudden like almost not present in here. And one thing, I mean, you can also see that like, you know, the numbers are rather small. So and because I was aware that you might get artifacts of like small sample size, there's also like some specialty about the structured decision-making, because apparently it's the only framework that forces the people who use it to really think about trade-offs, because they have like a very specific way of producing and visualizing results. So I also wanted to see if maybe that's an artifact of just, you know, like structured decision-making has this advantage because people have to do trade-offs. And so the other frameworks, you know, just have slightly less chances to end up on the best practice stack. So I also checked like how it looks when you use all 4 criteria except of trade-off. And as you can see, like it doesn't change much. Like structured decision-making still comes out best. It's just like not as dominant, but you definitely can see that like it's it definitely brings it up to almost 50% if you care about trade-offs. So the next thing I found was that good decision-making examples are not available for many countries, and especially if you look, you have to look a bit deeper than at first glance, because if you plot them just all around the world, then it doesn't look too bad. So what you see here is the world, and the size of the point is the number of examples I could find. So you see like the only 2 large dots are Australia and America. So Australia has 75 examples and the US has 120. And then the next size, the next like highest count of examples is China with 18. So there's quite a large gap. But overall, it looks as if the world is covered okay. There's a lot of stuff going on in Europe. And the color shows you the number of included criteria and the best example that you can find for this country. So dark blue means you find examples that include 5 criteria. Light blue means you find examples that include at least 4 criteria. And so you see that like there are lots of places in the world where you can find good examples. And these large gaps that you see in Africa, in mainland Asia, and in Eastern Europe, they are quite consistent with many other sort of literature reviews, because there's just not much data around for these places, which is unfortunate, but not really a surprise. And I've now plotted them again, like split up for academic and real world examples, and just like looking at the difference between the academic and every example doesn't look much of a change. You still have like the majority of examples in Australia and the US, but there's still lots of good examples around in other places. But then when I look at just these planning processes that actually describe conservation management that is either in a collaboration with management authorities or has been implemented, then all of a sudden the world looks much more empty. And you almost have only examples that use 5 criteria in Australia and the US and Canada, and almost no other country. And also the number of studies is like much, much lower in other places as well. You only have like 1 example or 2 examples in over countries in Southeast Asia. And all of a sudden the whole of Latin America is empty. So that means I would think that if you want to learn like what type of planning is actually happening in the world, in the real world, then the literature might be not the best place to find these examples, unless you are only interested in the US and Australia. Then the next thing I found was that there seemed to be some type of management that might be particularly exposed to less rigorous decision making. And so I tried to walk you through this graph, because there's also a lot of bubbles going on. And so what I plotted here is the number of examples and best practice for different management types. So each box is a different management type. So population management, threat abatement, spatial prioritization, restoration, and anything where they think about either choosing between these options or having some sort of combined management options. And on the y-axis, you see the number of examples that I found. And on the x-axis, you see the different frameworks. And the color indicates of if it's like an academic or real world example, and the size of the point is how many % of these examples use actually 4 or 5 criteria. And so what you can take away from here are several things. Like first, you can see if there is a particular framework that gets preferred to plan for specific types of management. So what's quite clear is, for example, if you look here at the restoration, like adaptive management seems to be preferred in academia and also in the real world. But if you compare the size of the points, then you see that the fraction of these studies that actually use more than 3 criteria is much lower than when people use other frameworks. Although, like, you know, they are just less examples, but they pay more attention to these scientific scientific criteria. Another thing that you can see is also like the distance between these points. So, for example, when you look at population management, you can see that adaptive management is really popular in academic studies, but in the real world, like, there are not so many people using that. At least, like, there are also other frameworks that are used as much as this one, and they use much more of the decision important criteria. And the same, like here in threat abatement, so the same case. And yeah, and overall, you can also then compare, like, where are these big bubbles located? And if you then again see, like, structured decision making seems to be used not in high numbers, but at least, like, you know, sort of there are examples for all types of management, and it seems to be including these criteria independent of the problem. Yeah, another thing is that it was probably also not a surprise at all that, like, systematic conservation planning is like the framework for spatial prioritization, and they're only plotted here the real world examples, because the academic number of examples, they would just hover somewhere in the middle of your living room above your screen, because there are, I think, like 168 examples or so of that. Cool. And then finally, I was interested in what is more important, the cook or the ingredients of the meal. And what I mean by that is that, especially with the structured decision making and the idea that this framework might be better suited to address, like, these important criteria, as there are in total not so many studies, it might just be that there are, like, some people who use this framework who are just, like, really good in doing that, and they publish a lot. And so it's not actually the framework that does the good work, but the people behind it. And so to be sure that this is not the case, I did, like, a co-author network to check. So what you can see here is a network of all co-authors, and, like, each of these little bubbles is an author, and if there's a line that connects them, it means they have published something together. And the color of the node means, like, which framework is the publication using. So this little cluster here, there's some people that use, like, multi-criteria decision analysis, and it's a team of 4 that have not published anything with someone else. And this is just a set of best practice, the 70 examples that use all 5 criteria. You can also see that in structured decision making, there is definitely, like, some clustering going on. There's, like, a group of people that published several things, but you can also see there are a lot of individual dark clusters here. So it means that it's not just, like, this one group of people. There's, like, a lot of stuff happening. yeah, and the size of the node means accounts for the number of publications. And what you can see also is that there is like this one big group of quite well-connected people that also publish quite diverse. So these purple nodes indicated these people have published different papers that use different frameworks. So they, for example, have published something with cost effectiveness, and then also something with systematic conservation planning. And I also wanted to know like what the differences were between the real world and academia. And what you can see is that like in the real world, like there are some smaller groups, but overall it's like, yeah, sort of more sort of parallel publishing, whereas in academia you have this like very big chunk. And I was curious, who is this? And you might be surprised or maybe not, but if you now label like this with the names, you see a lot of your friends from the Center of Center of Excellence for Environmental Decision Making. So here in the middle is Hugh and Matt Watts, and then you have Michael Boat, Marina Mills, Ayesha Tulloch, Kerry Wilson, Virgilio Hermoso, Simon Linky, Yadin Shadeh, and Tara Martin. And yeah, so it's like, it seems that, you know, the Center for Excellence is actually a Center for Excellence, which is quite cool. And it's also like very nice that I can actually give this talk to you guys, because I think UQ is quite the important central connection node. And I guess it's also great to know that, you know, like that you're in a good place to actually inform and like learn how to make good decisions for conservation management. So to have or think about the take-home message, I think like these results like point to a seemingly great opportunity to improve decision plans by paying more attention to these important criteria. And it's also obviously possible to do good work with any of these frameworks. But overall, there is like half of the plans that are made use 3 or less criteria. And I think we should at least be curious about what the reasons might be, and be aware that this might lead to unintended outcomes. So structured decision-making seems to lead to more frequent inclusion of important criteria in a real-world context. And the interesting thing is that almost all examples are in the US. So that's actually like the location is not where the authors are from, but the places and species that are planned for where they are located. So this is something that gets used in the US, but not abroad. And maybe I hope that I can like draw attention to this framework and maybe inspire some people to think about maybe using it more in other countries and locations. Then another thing was like adaptive management and systematic conservation planning are far more popular in academia than in the real world, and particularly when you're interested in using a lot of decision scientific criteria. And it might be also like interesting to be aware of that, like if we push these framework in our like more scientific publications, that this might not really reflect what's happening in the real world, and think more about like the reasons why that might be. Then the large gaps in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia are there and still there after all these like decades that we are aware of these gaps, but they're even larger when you're interested in actually real world conservation planning. So they're and I think like one of the papers that Elisa recently published, where she was doing this like large translation work with people in Latin America about like coral reef projects. I think these things are hugely important to make things visible that are happening in the world, because if we turn to the literature in order to get informed of what's happening in conservation and what do people do and does it work or not, if we don't see the majority of the things that are happening, I think it might be very hard to learn and to improve what we are doing. Then obviously explicit trade-offs are apparently not very popular to anyone, which is interesting. And overall, robust decision-making seems not to be the default. And I think it's quite important that people start to pay more attention to the decision process in conservation. And I think it might be like a really great opportunity to improve a lot of decision plans by pointing to the importance of having these on board. Of course, there are also like some remaining mysteries that I definitely was not able to uncover with just reading papers. And these are the reasons behind the missing criteria. And I don't know if maybe either people are not aware that these things are important. And then another reason might be that there is definitely like a trade-off between the rigor and time and budget that gets spent on the decision process itself compared to actually then doing work on the ground. And also like the flexibility that you can have in the planning process, if, as you know, just, I think like people value a lot if they don't have to follow very strict guidelines. And then of course there might be also the case that they get actually used, but they just don't get reported. So they might be either considered to be a distraction from the main message of focus in academic papers, or there might be word limits, and so they just don't make the final cut, or maybe even that like they get scrapped during submission process because the editors or reviewers think they're not important. And then finally, I didn't use any grey literature in my review. I only used like things from the peer review world, and yeah, I do think that that 128 examples are quite a surprisingly high number. But of course, I don't know how this compares to all the grey literature that didn't make it into the peer-reviewed literature. And if maybe, I don't know, maybe only the bad examples get published, I don't know. And then, yeah, finally, like if you want to chat more about that, you can always drop me a line on email, and you can find me on LinkedIn, Google Scholar, ResearchGate. And yeah, and special thanks to my 2 labs and my really wonderful supervisor team, Eric Tremmel, Brandon Winkel, and Fiona Fiedler, and the UniMelb and the John Hodgson Scholarship for making me able to pay my rent and work on these things. And of course you for listening to that. And I would be really stoked if you could have a short discussion, and if you tell me what you think and what you're curious about and what you maybe think might be missing in here. Yeah, thanks for listening.